let's say that I did want to apply the Turnitin originality check feature to my existing assignment. It's absolutely something I can do. If I clicked on the arrow next to written assignment 2, I go to edit assignment. You'll notice when we were setting this up originally, I only really edited the properties tab. But I do want to point out a few of these other tabs, especially if you're starting now to have a formal graded assignment. We know we're going to use Turnitin. Presumably, we also then have restrictions on when they're allowed to submit. Under the restrictions tab, you have controls for visibility and access for students. You'll notice there's both a due date and an end date, and that's not terribly obvious as to what the difference is, but there is a functional difference. Basically, the due date, it shows up in the calendar for students as the last moment when they're supposed to submit their work. However, it doesn't actually enforce that. The student would be allowed to submit work late into this assignment folder. It does get flagged as late, so there's red text. It would be very clear to both the student and you that they did upload it after the expected time, but the system would still allow them to do it. The difference is with end date, this is a hard cutoff. Students would no longer be able to upload that file at all. So whether you decide to use due date or end date will really come down to whether you're willing to accept that work, whether there's value in allowing the student to upload after when you expect the work. If you're going to accept it and take off a percentage for being late, then you'd want to do due date. If you were going to accept it and provide feedback, even if you gave them a 0, you would do due date. But if you really just didn't want them to waste their time anymore, you're not going to grade it anyways, you don't have time to look at it anyways, then just set an end date, and then there's no confusion. The student simply couldn't upload it at that point. They'll get a message to that effect. So I would usually set one or the other. My personal preference would be due date because it's still an opportunity for me to provide feedback, even if I wasn't going to give them a grade for something. So you can see how you can kind of set either a small window of just an hour on any given day, or you might set this to be over the next week, I expect you to submit this file, or whatever the work might be. And then we'll go over to the Turnitin tab. So Turnitin is a company, it's a third party that we have an integration with for our system. They actually have a couple of different features. One of them is called GradeMark. GradeMark is one of the options for annotation, inline annotation. But at this point, it's largely redundant with what eConestoga can just already let you do for annotating documents. However, it is something that you'll have to check the box for if you wanted the originality check, which is probably why you're on this tab. It's just the way that integration works. So we're forced to turn on GradeMark, even if we never use it. Then we are able to check the originality checkbox. And then we have a few other options. So first of all, do you want every document to be automatically scanned using the Turnitin process? If so, then you would leave this option, the automatic originality check for all submissions. That just means that every document comes in, it's just going to be scanned straight away. You won't have to do anything manually. If you really are only interested in certain individuals, if you are only going to scan the ones that you're a little bit suspicious about, then you could instead choose to identify the ones, and you basically click a button for any one of them, and that would launch into that process. You also have a decision here for whether or not you want students themselves to see the Turnitin score. And this is something that there's value, I think, either way. There's value in potentially letting students see their scores, so it's clear to them what you also saw. No surprise then if you end up using that or factoring that into grading somehow. But what I've learned is that the way that a lot of instructors want to actually use this feature, the allow learners to see it, is to potentially set up a structure where students can see the score of their work and have an opportunity to rewrite if they themselves see that the score is higher than a certain amount, right? And that's fine. That's a fine approach. It's a fine use of the tool. It sort of puts the ownership on them a little bit to get it down below a certain amount, so that you're not just getting their work and punishing them, and they didn't know that they would be caught, sort of thing, right? So this is fine, but there's an additional setting that you would have to change to set that scenario up effectively. So what I'm going to do is imagine that this assignment folder, the written assignment 2, this is where I expect to get their final work. This is the one that they're giving to me to grade, right? At this point, they've already potentially done their drafts and their revisions. So I'm not going to allow learners to see this particular Turnitin score, but I have enabled Turnitin. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a second folder, a separate folder, where the students can just upload as many drafts as they want, get as many scores as they want until they're happy with their results. And there's one other technical reason why I'm doing that. It's not just to separate them to keep them easy to see so that you can ignore the draft, etc. There's a really important technical reason as well, which I'll get to here.